Some stories don't begin with fireworks. They start with a look, the kind that lingers long enough to wake something inside that's been quiet for far too long. Then comes the pull, not rushed, not wild, but powerful like destiny, slowly reaching out and wrapping itself around two souls that were always meant to collide. One night becomes everything, breathless, tender, unforgettable. Each kiss feeling less like a moment and more like a vow whispered against skin. And even when the fire settles and the first light of dawn touches the world, something remains soft but unbreakable, because what happened wasn't just passion. It was the beginning of forever. Welcome to a place where love isn't simply told. It is felt, where every story speaks directly to the heart and reminds you that some connections are written in places we cannot see. It started with a single glance that should have meant nothing, polite, brief, forgettable. Yet there was something in the air when eyes met, something sharper than curiosity and softer than innocence, something that felt like danger disguised as fate. It wasn't welcomed, wasn't looked for, and certainly wasn't allowed. But there it was, crackling quietly, spreading through the body like a slow fever. Every boundary had been clear until that moment. Loyalty, logic, promises made over years all stood tall like walls built to withstand time. But desire doesn't knock gently. It slips through cracks, finds the thinnest places, creates gaps where none existed. One glance turned into a second too long. The breath caught, the heart forgot how to pretend. And suddenly, something forbidden shimmered just under the surface of ordinary life. Nothing reckless happened immediately. That's how desire works. When it's real, it waits, stalks softly, blends into routine. Little things began to change. A pause in conversation that wasn't there before. A question asked not because an answer was needed, but because hearing the voice mattered. A moment of standing closer than necessary, not quite touching, yet every cell responding as though skin had already met. The mind tried to resist. Late night thoughts reminded of consequences, of people who could get hurt, of principles once worn like armor. But passion has a way of whispering louder than reason, telling stories of what might be, drowning out what should be. And in the space between restraint and surrender, everything began to tremble. It was one careless moment that tipped it all over. A hand brushed against another, not accidentally, not fully intentionally either, just enough to feel warmth. That simple touch struck like lightning. The world shrank to that point of contact. Every heartbeat thundered. In that instant, both knew a line had been crossed, maybe not in action, but undeniably in desire. After that, every exchange became charged. Eyes learned to speak the language of longing, lips curved with hidden meaning. Silence wrapped the air tightly around them whenever they were near. Isolation became impossible even in crowded rooms, because no amount of distance could make the body forget what the soul had already claimed. Moments escalated quietly but uncontrollably, a laugh that lingered. A shoulder leaned against just a little too long, a whisper shared in a way far too intimate for the words being said. Desire kept pushing, wearing down every defense with persistence disguised as fate. The harder the mind tried to pull back, the more magnetic the pull became, convincing that this wasn't chance, wasn't wrong, that it was destiny mistaken for temptation. The first real surrender arrived under a sky too dark and too honest. There were words whispered that sounded like confessions. The air felt thick, heavy with truth they could no longer ignore. And then it happened, a kiss that tasted like freedom and destruction all at once. Soft at first, testing, trembling on the edge, but the second their mouths truly met, resistance died. It didn't matter anymore how dangerous it was, it only mattered how right it felt. Bodies curved closer until no space remained. The kiss deepened, not hungry, not rushed, but filled with a devotion that terrified. Hands gripped shoulders like anchors, afraid that walking back to the safe side would be impossible after this. Hearts thundered, breaths grew shallow, and desire melted into something far more potent, a belonging that felt ancient. In that embrace, all the walls crumbled. There were no rules left, no expectations to live up to, only a raw force dragging them into a fire both had secretly kindled. It did not burn violently. Instead, it consumed slowly, lovingly, urging them to savor every spark. The ground beneath might have been shaking. Everything they knew might have been falling apart, but in each other's arms, it felt like everything was finally coming together. When parting finally came, it wasn't a clean break. Fingers clung, lips brushed again, eyes held onto each other a second too long before letting go. Nothing had been spoken about what this meant. Nothing needed to be. Because from that point on, even when they were apart, they carried each other like a heartbeat under the skin. Desire, once awakened, refused to sleep again. It threaded through days and nights, turning simple moments into unbearable longing. Drinking coffee tasted like kissing that mouth again. Walking down familiar halls felt like stepping back into that embrace. Reality kept pressing in, reminding of responsibilities, of promises made to others, of lives that shouldn't be disrupted. Yet nothing could drown the memory of that kiss or the truth hidden inside it. Love had begun to grow in the shadows of desire, quiet, insistent, dangerous in its purity. It whispered not of recklessness but of inevitability. It promised not chaos but completion, and as much as the mind tried to deny it, the heart knew some lines are destined to be crossed, not to ruin, but to reveal. There are choices that look like mistakes to the world, but feel like salvation to the soul. Because one moment of real connection can mean more than years of loyal routine. That's the truth desire taught, that sometimes what looks wrong is exactly what was meant all along. Some boundaries aren't broken by recklessness, but by love waiting patiently for courage. It wasn't supposed to happen, not here, not with him. Yet from the moment his lips brushed against mine, it felt less like a choice and more like something inevitable. There had been a subtle build up in the air long before that moment, an ache so quiet it hardly made a sound, buried beneath polite words and restrained glances, waiting for something brave enough to break it open. I remember that first stolen kiss not as an action, but as a collapse, like the breath giving out of a body that had been holding itself too tightly, too long. They were lips I shouldn't have tasted, a mouth I shouldn't have welcomed, but nothing had ever made more sense than that one reckless surrender. The world didn't spin, it stilled. Every frantic thought fell silent, as if fate itself had finally sighed in relief, watching two souls come together the way they were always meant to. His hands found my waist with a slow hunger, fingers curling as though they had spent lifetimes searching for that exact curve. I shouldn't have leaned in. I shouldn't have let myself dissolve into him. But the moment our bodies touched, something fierce untangled deep inside, a kind of knowing that felt ancient, raw, aching with truth. I felt his warmth even through layers of cloth, felt the shiver ripple down my spine as he pulled me in, chest to chest, breath mixing hotter, heavier with each passing second. We were pressed so close I could hear the shape of his heartbeat, steady but demanding, calling something helpless and hopeful out of mine. Each stolen second deepened the pull until it wasn't just desire, it was destiny. His mouth moved over mine like a prayer, as if worshipping something holy that had been hidden too long in shadows. Hands slid along forbidden paths, not hurried, but deliberate, as if learning the map of my body was not about lust, but remembering. He cupped the back of my neck, thumbs scorching along my throat, pulling me deeper into his kiss until I tasted him everywhere, tasted promises and danger, and longing so sharp it almost hurt. I melted into it willingly. Because I wasn't just being kissed, I was being claimed, and in that moment I wanted to be. When we finally broke for air, our faces stayed close, breaths crashing, eyes wide with something neither of us dared to name. Regret had no place there, There was only awe, terror, yes, but awe that something so forbidden could feel so right. My skin burned where he'd touched it. My lips trembled from the way his mouth had molded mine, slow and consuming. His fingers brushed my cheek like he was afraid I'd disappear, like he'd been starving and finally tasted what he'd dreamed of. His whisper lingered at the corner of my mouth, asking nothing, demanding nothing, but everything in his eyes begged me not to end it. I couldn't. My heart had already begun rewriting everything it believed about love. It didn't feel delicate or gentle. It felt dangerous, unhinged, necessary. Love shouldn't have teeth, yet I swore this one bit me down to the bone. He kissed me again, slower now, and everything inside me surrendered. The night around us thickened, stretching wide to hold the impossible heat between two bodies that had no right to belong to each other, yet did. Nothing felt rushed because fate was patient. Each movement was deep, precise, like we were carving new truths into each other's skin. Lips trailed across my jaw, down my neck, every touch burning with worship and possession. His breath was warm, heavy, reverent against my skin, and mine shook each time he exhaled. My fingers fisted in his shirt, desperate, as if I could drag him closer than skin would allow. That wasn't just desire, it was the rawest urge to be known completely, to be seen without disguise. He lifted my hand to his mouth, kissed each knuckle like I was something precious, then pressed my palm to his heart. Its frantic pounding thundered beneath my touch, proof that I wasn't alone in this madness, that he felt it too, that the force pulling us together wasn't sin but fate. When he whispered my name, it wasn't as someone he had met, it was as someone he had finally found. His voice trembled not with fear, but with the overwhelming honesty of being exactly where he had always been meant to stand. Our foreheads rested together, sweat mixing at our temples, everything around us forgotten. Time had stopped behaving like time. There was no turning back after that. Something irreversible had happened when lips met where they shouldn't. Something holy had begun when hands claimed what wasn't theirs. We could have stepped away, pretended it hadn't happened, rewritten the night into a lie, but neither of us wanted to, because in the fierce fire of that forbidden closeness, we had tasted a truth no force could undo, no guilt could dampen, no distance could deny. Even as the night cooled around us, a different kind of warmth settled low in our bodies, not frantic anymore, but certain. He slid his hand along my spine, pulled me into one last kiss that pulsed like a heartbeat, slow and deep and life-changing. I let myself fall into it entirely, knowing something had shifted forever inside me. Not lust but love, not fire but fate. And the most terrifying, beautiful part was realizing I didn't want to escape it. Because that night didn't ruin me, it began me, it should have faded. That's what logic expected, that once space returned and days stretched between each memory, the body would quiet down again. But logic has never been strong when desire has once tasted what it wants. Long after the room had gone silent, long after footsteps had walked away and doors had closed, the body still hummed with the echo of him. Every part that he touched seemed to pulse with the memory of his hands, as if he'd marked the skin without leaving a mark at all. Distance tried to wash him away, and guilt whispered that it should never have happened. Yet nothing could stop the way heat bloomed at a single thought of his mouth. That mouth that had lingered, traced, savored. That mouth that had spoken softer with its silence than any words ever could. Even when trying to sleep, the memory of his breath against the curve of a shoulder, the press of his chest, refused to fade. Every heartbeat thudded with the reminder of how it once raced beneath his touch. Every sense betrayed any attempt to forget. A faint cologne carried on a stranger's coat brought back the moment his arms wrapped tight, pulling closer than anyone ever had. The rustle of fabric brushed against the skin like his fingertips had done, slow, deliberate, reverent, as though each inch mattered to him more than his own breath. And then the mind surrendered completely, replaying the way he whispered against the neck, the way his teeth lightly grazed, igniting sparks that stretched down the spine like fire. There was a moment in the dark when everything between them hung heavy with things unspoken but fully known. The pull wasn't innocent, it was raw, haunting, an ache that possessed more depth than anything that had been allowed before. Every time lips met, it wasn't just a kiss. It was a confession, one that said, "This isn't supposed to happen." But it must, and when surrender finally happened, it was total. No part held back. One hand fisted in his shirt, while another trembled against the back of his neck. Legs tangled, breath hitched, and every sensation etched itself with animal clarity. The way his body fit, the way he groaned when fingertips slid into his hair, the shudder in his chest when nails dragged down his back. Passion wasn't even the right word. It was possession. Needing him didn't feel like a desire, it felt like a need written into the bone. When it was over, it wasn't over, because even as he pulled away and the room cooled, heat still churned just beneath the skin. Trying to speak of ordinary things felt absurd. The body had been awakened beyond ordinary. It recognized his absence too sharply. Hours later, it still felt like he was hovering over, breath ghosting ear, whispering things that made knees weak and heart pound so fiercely it hurt. The curve of his smile haunted worse than a sin, because it promised what could never be kept forever, yet also could never be taken back. When distance finally settled between, guilt arrived like an uninvited guest. But guilt had no strength compared to what the body remembered, and memories weren't fading, they were blooming with time. Every day without him wasn't distance. It was a slow burn that traveled across skin like a reminder of what it once held. Even loneliness didn't feel empty, it felt full of his presence that refused to leave. Sometimes, walking past a mirror, there was a pause, a flicker of shock at the sight of flushed cheeks that weren't flushed anymore, but remembered how they once were beneath his gaze. Lips tingled in absence, thighs pressed together involuntarily, suddenly recalling the ache they felt when wrapped around his hips. A heartbeat skipped, as if the body expected him to appear behind with a possessive grip, and that voice, that low rumble that asked nothing but commanded everything. It was haunting, beautifully, painfully, because every touch, every surrender, every gasp shared between bed sheets left something behind that no shower could wash off, no hours could erase. It lived underneath everything else. Beneath clothes, beneath smiles offered to the world, underneath the composure that said life goes on, there lay a truth. Passion like his doesn't vanish. It lingers, it hums, it waits in silence. There are moments, still, when fingers twitch without reason, tracing invisible patterns in the air, trying to find where his skin used to be. Nights grow heavy again, not with his presence, but with the echo of what his presence did to flesh, to heart, to soul. And in those moments, forgetting isn't an option, because the body remembers, it always does. Sometimes love stays, sometimes it leaves, but passion like this never ends. Love had always been something quiet. Gentle conversations, shared routines, a kind of safety that never broke the surface. That kind of love was easy, it asked nothing, risked nothing, and expected life to follow a calm, familiar rhythm. Until a truth arrived that didn't whisper but thundered underneath the skin, awakening something fierce and unforgettable that could never be folded back into ordinary life again. It started with the simplest things, the way every word from him felt like it had intention, how every silence between conversations felt heavy rather than empty. There was no explanation for why his presence pulled so deeply. It just did. The first time he looked long enough to hold the gaze, it wasn't flirtation, it was connection. The kind that seemed to rise from somewhere ancient and sacred, curling steadily around the heart before reason even had a chance to argue. Day by day, It got harder to pretend things were the same. The predictable comforts of life began to feel too small, as if even the safest arms offered no real shelter. He didn't promise anything. He didn't try to persuade. He simply was, and that was enough to unravel everything thought about love before. Feelings turned into a quiet storm. There were moments when it felt impossible to breathe because the need for closeness was so intense it bordered on ache. Not just physical closeness, something far more dangerous, a kind of emotional nakedness where walls had no use. He saw right through them anyway. He saw every fracture, every ache, and somehow loved them too. That was the truth that made everything impossible. He loved not the simple version, but the whole complicated, imperfect story that lived inside. There were nights filled with conversations so raw the air itself trembled between each word. Confessions spilled out things that had never been said out loud to anyone else, not because there was a plan or reason, but because somehow it felt safe enough to unburden everything, and when he listened, he didn't flinch. He held it all with a kind of tenderness that felt almost holy, as though the broken pieces finally found the hands that knew exactly how to carry them. Touch became something more than touch. His arms didn't just wrap around, they gave a sense of belonging that went deeper than any vow ever spoken. His breath against the skin made everything else disappear. It wasn't wild hunger, it was devotion, pouring slowly and endlessly. And once that devotion was tasted, once the soul understood what it meant to be held like that, no ordinary warmth could compare. Choices that once seemed simple became impossible. How does one turn away from something that makes the heart beat in ways it never knew possible? How does one pretend that safety is enough once the soul has known a fire that refuses to die, even in silence? There were tears sometimes not from grief, but from knowing that nothing in life had ever felt this right, this destined, this utterly irreplaceable. It felt like life had been asleep and finally woke up. Walking away would have been easier before he came along, before nights became sacred, before laughter curled up inside the chest and stayed, before just hearing his voice could dissolve every fear. Once someone sees you to your depth and loves you there, how does one close those eyes and return to living half-asleep? The truth was brutal in its beauty. If love does not change you, it is not love at all. Sometimes it hurt. The intensity wasn't always gentle. Sometimes it ripped through like lightning, making every nerve feel exposed. But even that kind of beautiful pain was better than feeling nothing at all. Because within that pain was also the deepest joy, the kind that made breathing feel purposeful, the kind that made waking up feel like a gift, knowing somewhere in the world his heartbeat existed too. And so, trying to leave wasn't just difficult, it was unbearable. Every attempt to distance only made the heart race harder, clinging to the memory of his hands, his scent, his words. Even the idea of someone else felt like betrayal, not to him but to the soul itself. Because once that kind of love is known, everything else feels pale, diluted, lifeless. Some love stories don't shout. They whisper truths so powerful they reshape the inside of you forever. And the moment those truths take root, leaving becomes the one thing the heart can no longer survive. If this story stirred something deep within you, don't let it end here. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because every story shared here is another heartbeat waiting to be felt again.